The room was a sterile box of grief, painted in shades of beige and bureaucratic indifference. It smelled of bleach and old paper, a chemical tang that failed to mask the deeper metallic scent of finality that clung to the very air of the county coroner's annex. Fluorescent lights hummed a low, monotonous dirge from the ceiling, casting a flat, unforgiving glare on the dozen or so people scattered across the rows of uncomfortable plastic chairs. This was not a court of law, but a court of conclusion, a place where the messy narrative of a life was trimmed, sanitized, and given an official one-line epitaph. Today, that life was Marcus Thorne's. At the front of the room, behind a heavy oak lectern that seemed to absorb all light and warmth, stood Dr. Alistair Finch. He was a man sculpted from ego, his posture ramrod straight, his silver hair coiffed into a perfect frozen wave. His suit was Italian silk, a shade of charcoal so dark it looked like a hole in the fabric of the drab room, and his cufflinks, solid gold, caught the sterile light with tiny, arrogant glints. He was the chief medical examiner, a title he wore like a coronation robe. He surveyed the small crowd, the grieving widow, her brother, a handful of somber-faced reporters with notepads poised, and a pair of uniformed officers, with an air of practiced professional sympathy that did not quite reach his cold, analytical eyes. To him, this was not a tragedy. It was a Tuesday. It was a neat puzzle he had solved, and now was the time for the grand, albeit mundane, reveal. In the third row, almost swallowed by the oppressive quiet, sat Leo. He was 17, a boy on the precipice of manhood, yet he seemed younger, folded into himself in a way that made him appear small and insubstantial. He wore simple jeans and a plain gray hoodie, the fabric worn soft at the cuffs. His hands were clasped loosely in his lap, his posture relaxed, but it was the relaxation of a stone, not of a person at ease. His stillness was profound, an unnerving pocket of absolute calm in a room simmering with sorrow and tension. His dark hair fell over his brow, shadowing eyes that were fixed on the polished floor, not in shyness, but in deep, unshakable concentration. He was here with the Thorne family, a neighbor's son who had been the first to find Marcus. They had asked him to come, a quiet gesture of shared trauma, never suspecting the true reason for the boy's silent, heavy presence. Dr. Finch cleared his throat, the sound amplified by a microphone into a dry, authoritative crackle. The reporters' pens began to scratch against paper. "We are gathered for the formal reading of the findings regarding the death of Mr. Marcus Thorne," he began, his voice a rich baritone that filled the room, a voice accustomed to being heard, to being the final word. Mr. Thorne, a respected member of our community, was found deceased at the base of the grand staircase in his home on the morning of October 12th. He paused, letting the clinical facts settle like a shroud over the room. Mr. Thorne's widow, a fragile woman named Eleanor, let out a soft, choked sob. Leo did not look up. He felt the woman's pain as a cold spike in his own chest, a familiar echo. But beneath it, a different feeling churned, a hard, unyielding certainty that was as solid and real as the plastic chair beneath him. He had been there. He had knelt on the cold marble floor beside the man's broken body, his hand hovering just for a moment over Marcus's still-warm arm. And in that single, fleeting instant of proximity, he had seen it all, not as a memory, but as a direct, brutal experience. The shouts, the shove, the sickening, final crack. The image was burned into his mind, a perfect, incorruptible recording. After a thorough and comprehensive examination, Dr. Finch continued, his tone dripping with self-importance, "My office has determined the cause of death. The subject sustained a catastrophic fracture to the C2 vertebra, along with significant cranial trauma consistent with a fall from a substantial height." He gestured with a well-manicured hand toward a large screen on the wall, where a diagram of a human spine appeared, a lurid red circle highlighting the upper neck. The toxicology report was clean. There were no signs of a struggle. The abrasions on the hands and forearms are classic defensive wounds, incurred as the victim instinctively tried to break his fall. He beamed, a predator proud of his kill. Therefore, the conclusion of this office is unequivocal. The manner of death is accidental, a tragic, unfortunate slip and fall. He looked directly at Eleanor Thorne, his expression shifting to one of condescending pity. A terrible accident, madam, but an accident nonetheless. The room was silent, save for the hum of the lights and the quiet weeping of the widow. The reporters scribbled their headlines. Case closed, another tragedy neatly filed away. But Leo's head was coming up. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his gaze from the floor, and for the first time his eyes, a startlingly clear and piercing shade of blue, focused directly on Dr. Alistair Finch. The air around him seemed to thicken, to grow cold. He stood up. The scraping of his chair legs on the linoleum was a shockingly loud intrusion into the funereal quiet. Every head in the room turned toward him. Dr. Finch's brow furrowed in annoyance at the interruption. Eleanor Thorne looked at him with confusion, her tear-streaked face a mask of bewilderment. Leo's voice, when it came, was not the cracking, uncertain tone of a teenager. It was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the room with an unnatural clarity. It was a voice devoid of doubt. That's not how he died. The statement hung in the air, a stark and simple contradiction. It was not an accusation. It was a correction. The reporters' pens froze mid-scratch. The two police officers in the back straightened up, their professional boredom evaporating in an instant. Dr. Finch stared at the boy, his practiced composure faltering for a fraction of a second. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his features before it was replaced by a mask of patronizing amusement. He gave a small, condescending chuckle, a puff of air that was meant to dismiss the boy utterly. "Excuse me," Finch said, his voice laced with a syrupy, disdainful patience. "And who might you be?" "My name is Leo," the boy answered, his gaze unwavering. "I was there. I found him. And you're wrong. It wasn't an accident." Finch's smile widened, but it was a predator's smile now, all teeth and no warmth. He leaned forward on the lectern, adopting the tone one might use with a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "Son," he said, the word dripping with condescension, "I understand that you've been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for witnesses, especially young ones, to misinterpret things. The mind plays tricks in moments of shock." He waved a dismissive hand. "I am the chief medical examiner for this county. I have 3 decades of experience and 2 medical degrees. I can assure you, with absolute certainty, that my findings are correct." The room seemed to exhale, a collective release of tension. The doctor had put the boy in his place. It was a sad, awkward interruption, but it was over. But Leo did not sit down. He did not flush with embarrassment or stammer an apology. He simply stood there, a pillar of quiet defiance, his clear blue eyes locked on the medical examiner. "You're wrong," he repeated, the words as calm and steady as before. "He didn't fall. He was pushed." A gasp went through the room. Eleanor Thorne's hand flew to her mouth. The reporters began scribbling furiously. This was no longer a routine inquest. It was becoming a story. Dr. Finch's face began to darken, the amusement curdling into visible anger. The boy was not just disagreeing. He was publicly challenging his authority, his expertise, his entire professional identity. "Pushed?" Finch scoffed, his voice rising in volume. "On what grounds do you make such a baseless inflammatory accusation? Did you see someone push him? Are you now a witness to a homicide?" He was mocking him, trying to bait him into an emotional outburst to expose him as a hysterical child. "No," Leo said, his composure utterly unnerving. "I didn't see it with my eyes. But I know it happened." He took a small step forward, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intense. He wasn't trying to break his fall. The abrasions on his arms, they aren't from the stairs. They're from the ring, the one with the sharp eagle crest he was wearing. A deep, profound silence fell over the room. This was a new detail, a specific, verifiable piece of information. Dr. Finch's smug expression froze on his face. In the back of the room, a young plainclothes detective named Miller, who had been at the crime scene, felt a sudden, cold jolt. He remembered the ring, a heavy, gold signet ring on the victim's right hand. He had noted it, but hadn't thought much of it. Leo continued, his voice a low, steady current. The man who pushed him, he grabbed Marcus's right arm first. Marcus twisted away, and the sharp edge of the man's own ring dug into his skin, scraping him. 2 deep scratches, right above the wrist. They're not defensive wounds, they're offensive wounds. From the killer. The detail was so precise, so bizarrely specific, that it defied immediate dismissal. It was not the kind of thing a traumatized teenager would invent. It was the kind of thing a person who was there would know. Dr. Finch stared for a moment, truly speechless. He had seen the abrasions. He had dismissed them, logged them as classic textbook signs of a fall. The thought that he could have missed something so fundamental, so damning, was anathema to him. His entire world was built on the foundation of his own infallibility. His mind raced, scrambling for a rational explanation to swat away this infuriating boy. He hadn't examined the killer, so how could he know about his ring? It was a fantasy, a lucky guess, a desperate bid for attention. Yes, that was it. The boy was a disturbed attention seeker. His anger returned, now buttressed by a renewed sense of righteous authority. "That is the most ludicrous, preposterous fabrication I have ever heard," Finch boomed, his voice cracking like a whip. He pointed a trembling finger at Leo. "You come into this official proceeding, you traumatize this grieving family with your disgusting fantasies, and you dare to question my professional findings with this pulp fiction nonsense about a killer's ring?" He slammed his hand down on the lectern. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "You are making a mockery of this investigation. You are showing contempt for this office." His face was flushed a deep, mottled red. The mask of the calm professional had been torn away, revealing the snarling, insecure ego beneath. He was losing control, and he knew it, which only made him angrier. "Security!" he bellowed, gesturing wildly toward the 2 uniformed officers at the back. "Remove this. This boy. Get this delusional brat out of my hearing. Now." The 2 officers, a burly veteran and his younger partner, exchanged a hesitant look. They started forward, their expressions a mixture of reluctance and duty. The crowd murmured, a low, shocked hum. Eleanor Thorne was looking at Leo now, not with confusion, but with a dawning, desperate hope. The boy's certainty was a lifeline in her sea of grief. What if he was right? Leo didn't resist as the officers approached. He didn't struggle or shout. He simply stood his ground, his gaze still fixed on Dr. Finch, a look of profound, almost sorrowful disappointment in his eyes. He had offered the truth, and it had been met with rage and ridicule. He had expected it. It was always like this. As the older officer placed a heavy hand on his shoulder, Leo turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the back of the room until they found Detective Miller. The detective was standing stiffly, his face pale, his mind reeling. The boy's description of the scratches, the impossible detail about the killer's ring, it resonated with a deep, gut-level wrongness he had felt at the scene. An anomaly on the victim's wrist that didn't quite fit the narrative of a simple fall. A detail he had noted but which Finch had summarily dismissed during the initial walkthrough. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting moment, Leo spoke again, his voice no more than a whisper, meant only for the detective. But in the supercharged silence of the room, it was audible to those nearby. "Project Chimera," he said. "Authorization code, Nightingale." Detective Miller froze. The words meant nothing to him, a string of nonsensical syllables. Yet, the way the boy said them, the sheer, unadulterated authority in that whisper, sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't a plea. It was an instruction. It was a key. The officer's hand tightened on Leo's shoulder, beginning to guide him toward the exit. The boy went without a word, his head held high, his calm an indictment of the chaos Finch had unleashed. Dr. Finch watched him go, his chest heaving, a triumphant sneer twisting his lips. He had vanquished the challenge. He had restored order. "My apologies for that unfortunate interruption," he said to the room, straightening his silk tie and smoothing his jacket. "As I was saying, the manner of death is accidental. This hearing is concluded." He banged a small ceremonial gavel, the sound hollow and pathetic. But Detective Miller wasn't listening. The boy's words echoed in his head. Project Chimera. Nightingale. It sounded like something out of a spy movie, but the look in Leo's eyes had been anything but theatrical. It was the look of someone activating a protocol, of someone pulling a fire alarm they prayed was connected. Miller was a young detective, only 5 years on the force, but he had good instincts. His gut, which had been murmuring since he first stepped into the Thorne mansion, was now screaming at him. He had seen arrogance and incompetence in his short career, but the sheer vitriolic rage from Dr. Finch was something else. It was the fury of a man not just being questioned, but being exposed. As the crowd began to disperse, a chaotic mix of reporters rushing for the phones and family members consoling the weeping widow, Miller made a decision. It was a career-ending decision if he was wrong. He would be a laughingstock, the cop who fell for a crazy kid's fantasy. But if he was right, if that boy was telling the truth, then a murderer was about to walk free, and an innocent man's death would be a lie. He thought of Leo's unnervingly calm face, the impossible certainty in his voice. He thought of the 2 scratches on Marcus Thorne's arm, perfectly parallel, too clean for a tumbling fall. Ignoring the stern look from his superior officer, Miller slipped out a side door into the sterile hallway. He pulled out his personal cell phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had no idea who to call. Project Chimera yielded nothing in a quick search. It was a dead end. He felt a surge of despair. Was he an idiot? Had he imagined the conviction in the boy's eyes? He leaned against the cool wall, trying to think. Nightingale. The second word? Maybe it was a person, a code name. He scrolled through his contacts, a desperate, hopeless gesture. He stopped on a number he had been given years ago at a multi-agency training seminar. It was for a man he had met only once, a strange, intense individual from a federal department whose name was just a string of acronyms. The man had dealt with odd cases, unexplained phenomena. He'd given Miller his card and said, "If you ever see something that doesn't fit in a box, something that breaks the rules of the world you think you know, call this number. Don't email, don't text, call, and use my name." The man's name had been Evan. He hadn't thought about it in years. But the man's intensity, his aura of deep, serious secrecy, it felt connected to the feeling Leo gave him. It was a wild, insane long shot. But it was the only shot he had. His thumb hovered over the call button. He thought about his career, his mortgage, the promotion he was up for. He thought about Dr. Finch's smug, furious face. And then he thought about Leo, being led away like a criminal for speaking a truth that no one else could see. He took a deep breath and pressed the button. Meanwhile, Leo was not in a holding cell. He was in a small, windowless family room down the hall, the kind of place designed to give bad news in. The 2 officers stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of what to do with him. They hadn't arrested him, merely removed him. They were waiting for instructions from the apoplectic medical examiner. Leo sat in a plush armchair that smelled faintly of stale tears, his hands resting on the armrests. He was perfectly calm, his breathing slow and even. He was listening, not with his ears, but with that other sense, the one that had been both a curse and a terrible gift his entire life. He closed his eyes, and the sterile room melted away. He was back in the Thorne mansion, kneeling on the floor. He hadn't touched Marcus Thorne, not physically. He had learned long ago that direct skin contact was overwhelming, a tidal wave of death that could drown him. But proximity was enough. The air around a recent violent death was thick with echoes, with psychic residue. For Leo, it was like standing in a room where a symphony had just been played. The notes still hung in the air, faint but perfectly discernible to his unique senses. He had felt the terror, the shock of betrayal from a trusted friend. He had felt the brute force of the shove, the sickening weightlessness, the final explosive impact, and he had felt the killer's presence. A man reeking of cigar smoke, expensive cologne, and a cold, reptilian panic. He'd felt the sharp metallic scrape as the killer's own ring, a garish thing with a bird of prey on it, had sliced across Marcus's arm in the brief struggle. He saw it all. He knew it all. This gift had isolated him his whole life. As a small child, he had recoiled from people who were ill, seeing the gray, creeping shadow of their demise. He had known his own grandmother would die of a stroke 3 days before it happened, a knowledge that had terrified him and made his family look at him with a fearful confusion. He had learned to hide it, to build walls of silence around himself, to appear quiet and withdrawn. But sometimes the silence was not an option. Sometimes the injustice of a lie was a shout so loud that he had no choice but to speak. Marcus Thorne had been a good man. He had been kind to Leo, always asking about his day, never treating him like the strange, quiet boy everyone else saw. He owed him the truth. He had known Finch would react this way. Men like Finch built their worlds on sand, and they feared the tide more than anything. The name he had given the detective was a desperate gambit. It was a name he had been given by a woman who had found him years ago, a woman who had explained that he wasn't alone, that there were others with unusual talents. She had told him that if he was ever in true danger, if his ability ever exposed him to a world that would not understand, he was to find a person in authority, a police officer, a soldier, and give them that code. It was a beacon, she had said, a call for extraction from a world of ignorance. He had never used it until today. He opened his eyes and stared at the blank wall, waiting. He had lit the beacon. Now he could only hope someone was watching for the smoke. Detective Miller's call was answered on the first ring. There was no greeting, just an electronic tone, followed by silence. Miller's blood ran cold. He almost hung up. "Hello?" he stammered. I'm trying to reach—" He couldn't remember the man's full name. "I was given this number by a man named Evan." A voice came on the line, a woman's voice, impossibly crisp and devoid of any emotion. "State your identification and authorization." "I'm Detective David Miller, badge number 714, Homicide Division," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Authorization. I was given an authorization. A boy gave it to me. He said, Project Chimera, Nightingale." For a full 10 seconds there was absolute silence on the other end of the line. Miller could hear his own frantic heartbeat. He had made a terrible mistake. This was some classified military line, and he was about to have a black helicopter land on his head. Then the woman's voice returned, the flat tone now sharpened with an edge of chilling urgency. "Detective Miller, where are you located?" "The County Coroner's Annex, 155 West Harding Avenue." "Where is the asset?" The asset? You mean the boy?" "Leo. He's in a room down the hall. They just kicked him out of the inquest for—" "Is he secure?" The voice cut him off. "Is he in immediate danger?" I don't think so. The medical examiner was furious, but he's just a kid. They've got him in a waiting room." The medical examiner's name. It was a command, not a question. Dr. Alistair Finch. Another pause, shorter this time. Miller heard the faint, rapid clicking of a keyboard. "Understood, Detective," the voice said. "Maintain your position. Do not engage with Dr. Finch or any other local authorities. A response team is being dispatched to your location. Their authority supersedes all local jurisdictions. Do not interfere with their operations. ETA is 7 minutes. The line went dead. Miller stared at his phone, his hand shaking. Asset. Response team. Supersedes all local jurisdictions. What in God's name had he just done? He felt a thrill of terror and a bizarre sense of vindication all at once. The boy was real. His ability was real. And he had just called in the cavalry. 7 minutes. It felt like an eternity and no time at all. Miller slipped back into the main annex hall, which was now mostly empty. Dr. Finch was packing his briefcase at the lectern, looking smug and self-satisfied. He caught Miller's eye and gave him a curt, dismissive nod, the kind a king gives a stable boy. Miller just stood by the wall, trying to look casual, his heart a drum solo against his ribs. He counted the seconds in his head. 6 minutes and 48 seconds after the call had ended, the double doors to the annex building burst open with a force that sent them crashing against the wall stops. The sound was like a thunderclap. Every person left in the room froze. Dr. Finch looked up, his face a mask of irritation at the crude interruption. Standing in the doorway were not police officers. They were 4 men and a woman, all dressed in identical, impeccably tailored dark gray suits. They moved with a predatory grace, their posture radiating a level of discipline that made the 2 uniformed cops by the door look like slouching teenagers. They fanned out, securing the exits with an unnerving, silent efficiency. They were not armed with visible weapons, but they gave off an aura of lethality that was more terrifying than any drawn gun. Leading them was a woman who could have been anywhere between 40 and 60. Her hair was a severe steel-gray bob, and her eyes, behind a pair of minimalist glasses, were the color of a winter sky. She was the woman from the phone. Director Evans. Her gaze swept the room once, taking in every detail with an almost computational speed. She ignored the gawking reporters, the stunned officers, and the sputtering medical examiner. Her eyes landed on Detective Miller, gave a fractional nod of acknowledgement, and then moved on, searching. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying the absolute expectation of an answer. Dr. Finch, recovering from his shock, stepped forward, his chest puffed out. "Who in the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling with indignation. "This is a restricted area. I am the chief medical examiner, and I demand to know why you are interrupting my—" Director Evans did not even look at him. She treated him like a piece of furniture. "I will ask you one more time," she said to the room at large. "Where is the boy?" The younger of the 2 uniformed officers, his face pale, pointed a shaky finger down the hall. In there. The family room." Evans turned, her team falling into formation around her as she strode down the hallway. Finch, now incandescent with rage at being so utterly ignored, hurried after them. "I am placing you all under arrest for trespassing and interfering with a government official," he shrieked, his voice cracking. One of the men in suits stopped and turned to face Finch. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at him. The man was tall and broad, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain. The look in his eyes was not hostile. It was not threatening. It was worse. It was a look of complete and utter emptiness. The look a scientist might give a microbe before placing it on a slide. Finch stopped in his tracks, a cold dread finally piercing his thick hide of arrogance. He suddenly felt very small and very, very fragile. Director Evans reached the door to the family room and pushed it open. Leo was sitting in the armchair exactly where he had been left. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time that day, a flicker of something other than calm certainty crossed his face. It was relief, a deep, bone-weary relief. Evans walked over to him, her severe expression softening almost imperceptibly. She stopped in front of his chair and performed a small, formal gesture. A slight inclination of her head, a sign of profound respect that was utterly shocking in its context. "Leo," she said, her voice quiet and laced with genuine regret. "We're sorry we're late. The beacon was faint." Leo simply nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. The fight was over. He didn't have to hold the line by himself anymore. Evans turned and walked back into the main hall, her team flanking her. Leo rose and followed, the two officers who had detained him now looking at him with a mixture of awe and terror. Dr. Finch was standing in the middle of the room, looking bewildered and frightened, his authority having evaporated like mist in the sun. Director Evans stopped in the center of the room, her gaze finally falling upon the medical examiner. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes cold and dissecting. "Dr. Alistair Finch," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "My name is Evans. I am the director of the Department of Preternatural Cognitive Phenomena, a branch of the federal government that you do not have the clearance to know exists." A wave of stunned silence rolled through the room. Preternatural cognitive phenomena. The phrase itself was a bombshell, shattering the mundane reality of the coroner's annex. "The boy you publicly humiliated and had removed from this hearing," Evans continued, her voice like chips of ice, "is not a delusional child. He is a Class 7 precognitive empath. He is a documented, verified, and protected national asset. His testimony in matters of this nature is not considered speculation. It is considered a primary source account, with a 98.7% accuracy rate in over 50 documented cases." She gestured to one of her agents, who produced a small, sleek tablet. "You dismissed his claim that the victim was pushed, and that the abrasions on his arms were from the assailant's ring." She looked at Finch. "Your examination was not thorough. It was lazy. It was arrogant. You saw what you expected to see." On the tablet, a video began to play. It was grainy, shot from a high angle. It was from a small, forgotten security camera in the corner of the Thorne Mansion's foyer, a nanny cam the family had forgotten was even there. It showed the top of the staircase. It showed Marcus Thorne arguing with another man. It showed the man, whose face was clear as day, grabbing Thorne's arm. It showed Thorne twisting away. And it showed the man, in a fit of rage, shoving Marcus Thorne with all his might. The video had no sound, but the violence of the act was sickeningly clear. "The man in that video," Evans stated, her voice flat, "is Jonathan Vance, Mr. Thorne's business partner, a man who, according to financial records we pulled 3 minutes ago, was embezzling millions from their shared company, a man who wears a very distinct, custom-made ring with an eagle crest on it." Dr. Finch's face, which had been red with anger, was now a pasty, ghastly white. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. He stared at the tablet, then at Leo, who was standing quietly behind Evans, his expression unreadable. "Your unequivocal conclusion of accidental death was not just an error, Doctor," Evans said, her voice dropping to a low, damning tone. "It was a lie. A convenient lie that would have allowed a murderer to escape justice. The only question is why." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Were you merely incompetent? Or were you complicit?" Finch began to tremble, a violent, full-body tremor. He shrank back, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at the imposing figures surrounding him, at the irrefutable evidence on the screen, at the quiet boy who had brought his entire world crashing down with a few simple words. His arrogance, his confidence, his lifetime of lauded achievement, it all crumbled to dust in an instant. Director Evans then turned her gaze to Detective Miller, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with a stunned, breathless awe. Her expression was professional, but there was a hint of approval in her eyes. "Detective Miller," she commanded, "based on the evidence presented, you have probable cause. Place Dr. Alistair Finch under arrest for obstruction of justice and suspicion of accessory to murder. A federal warrant for Jonathan Vance is being signed as we speak. My team will coordinate his apprehension." Miller, shaken from his stupor, moved forward. He fumbled for his handcuffs, his hands shaking, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Dr. Alistair Finch," he said, the words feeling surreal. "You are under arrest." He clicked the cold steel cuffs around the doctor's wrists. Finch didn't resist. He seemed to have shrunk, all the air and ego gone out of him, leaving only a sagging, pathetic husk. As Miller led him away, Finch looked back one last time at Leo, his eyes pleading, terrified, and, finally, comprehending. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Director Evans' team took command of the scene with chilling efficiency. The inquest was officially declared null and void. The case of Marcus Thorne's death was ripped from the hands of the local police department and elevated to a federal investigation. Jonathan Vance was apprehended less than an hour later at the airport, attempting to board a one-way flight to a country with no extradition treaty. The eagle-crested ring was on his finger. The few reporters who had remained were gently but firmly escorted out, their notebooks and recorders confiscated as evidence. They were left with a story so unbelievable they knew no one would print it, a confusing whirlwind of suited spooks, a psychic boy, and a disgraced medical examiner. The official story, released hours later, would be far more mundane. New evidence has come to light. Director Evans personally escorted Leo from the building, shielding him from the lingering, curious eyes. Her agents formed a protective cordon around them, moving as a single, intimidating unit. As they walked toward a fleet of black, unmarked sedans that had materialized at the curb, Leo stopped and looked back at Detective Miller. The detective was standing by his patrol car, looking dazed. Leo walked over to him, Evans and her team waiting patiently. "Thank you," Leo said, his voice quiet. "You listened." Miller shook his head, a slow gesture of disbelief. I don't know what I did. I just made a call." "You chose to believe something that seemed impossible," Leo said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "Most people don't." He paused. "The truth needed a voice. You gave it one." Before Miller could respond, Leo turned and walked back to the waiting sedan. He got in, and the door closed with a solid, final thud. The fleet of cars pulled away from the curb in perfect synchronization and disappeared into the city traffic, leaving Detective Miller standing on the sidewalk, alone with the wreckage of his former reality. He felt as though he had stood on the shore and witnessed a kraken rise from the deep, only to vanish again, leaving nothing but ripples behind. In the days and weeks that followed, the fallout was seismic. The arrest of a man as prominent as Dr. Alistair Finch sent shockwaves through the city's legal and medical communities. Under the pressure of federal interrogation, his composure shattered completely. It turned out his motives were not born of simple incompetence, but of something far more sordid. Jonathan Vance had not only been embezzling from his company, he had also discovered that Finch had a gambling addiction that had pushed him deep into debt with the wrong people. Vance had offered to clear Finch's debts in exchange for one simple, official lie: a tragic accident. Finch, seeing a lifeline, had taken it, never imagining that a quiet 17-year-old boy would be the one to unravel everything. The trial was swift. Faced with the video evidence and Finch's full confession, Jonathan Vance was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Dr. Finch, in exchange for his testimony, received a lesser sentence of 10 years for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and professional malfeasance. He was stripped of his medical license, his reputation annihilated, his name becoming a byword for corruption and hubris. The coroner's office was gutted from the top down. An external investigation revealed a culture of arrogance and corner-cutting that had been fostered under Finch for years. New oversight committees were formed, and rigorous mandatory peer review processes were implemented for all questionable deaths. The Finch Protocol, as it became known in law enforcement circles, became a mandatory training module for new coroners and detectives, a cautionary tale about the mortal danger of letting ego cloud evidence. Detective Miller, far from being disciplined, was quietly promoted. He became known in the department as a man with uncanny instincts, a cop who saw things others missed. He never spoke of Project Chimera, or the boy named Leo, but the memory lived behind his eyes, a secret touchstone of a world larger and stranger than he had ever imagined. Almost a year later, a letter arrived at the precinct for Detective Miller. It was handwritten on cheap prison stationery. It was from Alistair Finch. He was writing from a medium-security federal penitentiary, a place of concrete and regret so far removed from his former life of silk suits and adulation that it might as well have been another planet. The letter was rambling, pathetic, and filled with self-pity, but at the end there was a single, clear request. He wanted to see the boy. He needed to apologize. He asked Miller if he could somehow pass on the message. Miller wasn't sure what to do. He no longer had a number for Director Evans. He had no way to contact Leo. He put the letter in his desk drawer and tried to forget about it. 2 days later, his desk phone rang. It was an unlisted number. He answered. It was Director Evans. "Detective Miller," her crisp voice said without preamble, "we are aware of Mr. Finch's request. The asset has agreed to a meeting. You will facilitate it. A transport team will bring Finch to a secure location. You will be the only other person present. Instructions will follow." The line went dead. The meeting took place in a stark, neutral-colored room in a downtown office building that was owned by a shell corporation. There was a simple table and 3 chairs. Alistair Finch, looking 10 years older, was brought in wearing a plain gray jumpsuit. The fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He was thinner, his skin sallow, his hands trembling. He sat down heavily. Miller stood by the wall, feeling like a ghost. A moment later, the door opened and Leo walked in. He was taller now, his features sharper, but he still had the same unnerving calm. He wore a simple black jacket and jeans. He looked at Finch not with anger or triumph, but with a quiet, weary compassion. He sat down opposite the man who had tried to destroy him. Finch broke down. Sobs racked his body, harsh, ugly sounds in the quiet room. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words thick with tears. "I am so sorry. I was arrogant. I was a fool. I threw away my life, my honor, for nothing. You told the truth, and I mocked you. I was a monster." Leo listened patiently, letting the man's torrent of grief wash over the room. When Finch finally fell silent, exhausted and spent, Leo leaned forward slightly. "I didn't come here to hear you say you're sorry, Dr. Finch," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I came to see if you understood why you were wrong." Finch looked up, his face a mess of tears and confusion. "I was wrong, because you were right. Because he was murdered. Because I helped cover it up." "No," Leo said, shaking his head slowly. "That's just what happened. You were wrong the moment you decided what the truth was before you had all the facts. You were wrong when you valued your reputation more than a man's life. You were wrong when you saw a child and not a witness." He paused, his gaze intense. "The world is full of things you don't understand, Doctor. Your mistake was believing that they don't exist simply because you can't see them." Finch stared at him, the words sinking in like stones into deep water. He finally understood. His crime wasn't just obstruction. It was a profound failure of intellect and spirit. It was the sin of certainty. "What you did to me doesn't matter," Leo continued, standing up. "What matters is what you do now. You have 9 more years in that place. You can spend them rotting with self-pity, or you can spend them learning to listen. Your apology means nothing. Your actions might." With that, he turned and walked to the door. He gave a small nod to Detective Miller, a silent acknowledgement of their shared secret, and then he was gone. Leo did not return to his old life. He couldn't. His anonymity was gone, at least within the circles that mattered. Under the tutelage of Director Evans and the department, he was no longer just a boy with a terrible gift. He was an agent in training. They taught him to control it, to shield himself from the constant low hum of death that surrounded him, to focus his ability like a surgical instrument. He traveled, always quietly, to places where the truth was buried deep, to plane crashes with no black box, to cold cases decades old, to kidnappings where all hope was lost. He remained a quiet, humble young man, but now his silence was not a shield. It was a tool. He was no longer a boy haunted by what he saw. He was a guardian, a silent whisper of truth in a world full of loud and angry lies, forever moving toward the next echo, the next injustice that needed a voice.